Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Books and Books. We are live from Books and Books here in Coral Gables, with thanks to the Knight Foundation for their generous support. My name is Steve. On behalf of everyone here at Books and Books, we're very happy to have you with us. While you are silencing your cell phones, I show you our Books and Books newsletter. This will give you a breakdown of all the wonderful events we have at Books and Books. This can be found on the counter where tonight's books are being sold, or you can visit our website at booksandbooks.com for more information about the coming events. We present an average of 60 events every month, sometimes 4 a night. We have Spanish events, we have kids events, we have poetry readings, first-time authors, and celebrity signings. There's always an event for everyone's taste, and you can see the majority of them now are being live streamed. A few cameras here in the store that you can see. I also remind you that flash photography interferes with the live stream, so you can refrain from doing that. We would appreciate it. Again, I encourage you to pick up a copy of the newsletter, or you can go to our site for more information about all the events here. I also encourage you to give us your email address so that we can keep you updated and you won't miss anything. So if you do decide to watch these events via the internet, you can also call the store, the number on your screen while the event is in progress, to either ask a question of the author or you order a signed copy of the book, which can be sent to you with no charge for shipping here in the U.S. And don't forget to visit our new Books and Books. We have one now at the Arch Center downtown in the old Sears Tower. It's a beautiful bookstore and cafe. The menu is by Chef Allen and the bar is by Jack Daniels. Tonight we welcome Ted Henken and his very timely work, Entrepreneurial Cuba. But to formally introduce the author, we have not only the professor at FIU, he is also the director of Cuban Research Institute. Please give your warm welcome to Mr. George Duane.
Thank you, Steve, and thank you to Books and Books for hosting this event. As Steve said, I'm the director of the Cuban Research Institute, and we're very proud to sponsor this event. We do many of these book presentations in order to bring the best authors on Cuban and Cuban-American topics. And in fact, after tonight's presentation, we have a second book event, and I invite you to stay if you have the time. And this will be a book of aerial photography of Cuba by Mario Llovaisa, and it's a wonderful book as well. So let me introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Ted Henken, who co-authored the book that we're going to be talking about today with Canadian economist Archibald Ritter. The book is called Entrepreneurial Cuba, The Changing Policy Landscape. And the co-author, Dr. Henken, is a well-recognized expert in the different fields of Cuban, Latino, and Latin American studies. He has written eloquently and incisively on topics such as contemporary migration from Cuba, self-employment, and the internet in Cuba. He holds a PhD and an MA in Latin American Studies from Tulane University, and a BA in Sociology and English from Holy Cross College. Currently, he's an associate professor of sociology and Latin American studies with a dual appointment in the Department of Black and Latino Studies at Baruch College, City University of New York. He's a past winner of Baruch College's Presidential Excellence Award in Distinguished Teaching, and he teaches on various topics such as contemporary Cuban culture and society, sociology of the internet, contemporary Latin America, Latinos in the U.S., race and ethnic relations, international migration, and comparative urban studies. In addition, Dr. Henken is the past president of the Association for the Study of the Cuban Economy, ASCE, which met here in Miami last year. And he's also the author of a very popular and interesting blog, El Yuma, and he can explain to you what that means. He's also published several academic books, book chapters, and articles in well-regarded professional journals, such as the Latin American Research Review, Cuban Studies, Latino Studies, and Encuentro de la Cultura Cubana. In 2013, Dr. Henken co-edited and co-authored an authoritative reference book called Cuba for the Latin American in Focus series of ABC CLI-O. In my judgment, this is a remarkable academic achievement that synthesizes the current state of knowledge on Cuba and its diaspora for a very broad public, and I understand it's going to be translated into Spanish quickly. The book we're presenting tonight, Entrepreneurial Cuba, is a pioneering, empirically grounded, and theoretically sophisticated study of one of the most important changes in Cuba in the last decade, the emergence of a private, non-state sector economy on the island. Much of the evidence for the book, in addition to the statistics and other sources of information, come from Dr. Henken's long-term ethnographic fieldwork in Havana since 1999 till 2011, and he can also talk to you about why he can't go back to Cuba after that last trip. And this field work provides a tremendous wealth of information, interview data, and fascinating case studies of private restaurant owners, the paladares, guest house operators, and taxi drivers. Given yesterday's visit to Havana by an official U.S. delegation to reestablish diplomatic relations with Cuba and the recent expansion of small private businesses, el sector por cuenta propia on the island, this book could not be more timely and more relevant. So please help me welcome Dr. Ted Henken.
Thank you so much. All right, they told me I have a mic here, so I don't need to use the mic there. I want to extend a very hearty thanks to everyone who's here. Many of you in the audience have long and deep relations with me, going back years. Some of you I actually met in Cuba, some in Miami, some in New York, but I'm really glad all of you are here. I did want to give a special welcome to, there's a very special honored guest here today. He hasn't written any books yet, but I brought this so he would pay attention. This is Dimitri, my son. So if he falls asleep, I just spin this and he has to pay attention to Daddy for the next 45 minutes or so. Along with Dimitri, of course, is my wife Tasha and my mother-in-law Maria. So there's a lot of you here that I could recognize, but I figured Dimitri would be the priority tonight and for the next 20 or so years. So I also want to extend a really hearty thanks to Books and Books, which is really an anchor of culture in Miami, not just here in Coral Gables, but at their various bookstores around the greater Miami area. They also are a big part of the International Book Fair. I happened to be at the book fair in November. I was on a panel with Orlando Luis Pardo Lasso and Emily Schneider. Each of us have new books on Cuba, and it was really a great experience. And I didn't realize, even though I come to Miami so often, that really Miami is a cultural mecca, and that book event is one of the biggest in the United States every year. And so I hope to come back again to that. FIU is also a big co-sponsor of this event and co-sponsor of many events in conjunction with Books and Books. If a book that is important comes out about Cuba, they make sure that there's an event. So I was very grateful and pleased when Jorge Duani sent me an email back in October and said, you keep tweeting that your book is coming out. So when is it coming out so we can plan an event? So it is out. It is here in the flesh, and I'm very happy to present it to you tonight. The final thanks goes to Archibald Ritter, who is the co-author of this book. Arch and I worked on this book over probably about 10 years. And I spent, believe it or not, many a January, not in Miami, but in Ottawa, working with him. Since he's the senior author, I had to travel up to Canada in the cold in January to work on this book. But the work paid off, and we crossed the finish line, and the book is here. So Arch it deserves a big thanks and a big part of the credit for our work. So what I'm going to present today tries to lay out the argument of the book, but also tries to touch on some of the ways that the book's argument and the book's findings are implicated or are affected by events that started to unfold on December 17th, continuing till this week, historic events. And the events have divided a lot of people, close Cuba watchers, and we're going to give our take on that, and I'll give our take on that tonight. And I hope in the Q&A session we can have a robust but respectful discussion about some of those implications. You could, I guess, title or subtitle of my comments today, Entrepreneurial Cuba. We must end the embargo against Cuban entrepreneurs. In scores of interviews conducted over the past 15 years with Cuban entrepreneurs for our new book, Entrepreneurial Cuba, Arch Ritter and I often heard the following two very pregnant Cuban sayings. Dos dichos cubanos muy fuertes. And I'd like you guys in the audience to help me. I will begin the sayings and a little call and response in good Cuban tradition. I will call and you respond. So let's see who knows these sayings and can complete them. El ojo del amo, translated roughly as the eye of the owner fattens the horse. The second saying, el que tenga tienda, y si no, que la venda. All right. Whoever has a store should tend to it. And if not, then he better well damn sell it. I added a little bit there in translation. The first adage indicates that the quality of a good or service improves when the person performing it enjoys autonomy and has a financial stake in the outcome. Economics 101, as Nicholas Sanchez would tell us. The second saying suggests that if the Cuban government is unable to, quote, tend its own stores, then it should let others take them over. In essence, this is popular Cuban wisdom, and it demands that the state turn over to the private sector the economic activities it cannot operate effectively itself. Many of these activities, as we all know, are very, very present and active already in Cuba's ubiquitous underground economy. In other words, the U.S. embargo recently dealt a near fatal blow by the joint decision by Presidents Barack Obama and Raul Castro to reestablish diplomatic relations after 54 years. That embargo is hardly the principal blockade standing in the way of Cuba's economic revitalization. Though the American bloqueo has long been the target of withering, and we believe, well-deserved international condemnation, on the island, Cubans themselves are much more likely to criticize what they bitterly refer to as the auto-bloqueo, roughly translated as the internal embargo, imposed by the Cuban government itself on the entrepreneurial ingenuity, access to uncensored information and open communications, as well as basic civil and political rights of the Cuban people. This is the internal embargo. President Barack Obama has opened a door to potential U.S. investment in and import-export to and from Cuba's entrepreneurial and telecom sectors. But one of the questions that we ask in this book that is amplified by the recent changes is Raul Castro willing to allow U.S. companies to operate on the island? More important than that is the second question. Is his government ready to open up to the Cuban people by beginning to relinquish its tight control over private enterprise and the internet? While we believe, Arch and I, that it is both good and necessary for the United States to open up to Cuba and vice versa, to paraphrase the late John Paul II, Pope John Paul II, our book argues the following. Little economic progress or political freedom will be enjoyed by Cubans themselves until the Cuban government opens up to itself, to its own people, ceases to demand their acquiescence as subjects, and begins to respect them as citizens, consumers, and entrepreneurs with defensible and inalienable economic and political rights of their own. In fact, 2 weeks following the historic mid-December Obama-Castro announcement, the Cuban government received its first public test of whether its internal embargo would now be relaxed in light of the sea change in U.S. policy. On December 30th, the internationally renowned Cuban artist Tania Bruguera organized a public act of performance art in Havana's iconic Plaza de la Revolución. Dubbed Yo También Exijo, Bruguera invited Cuban citizens to share their own demands on the government and their visions for the island's future for 1 minute each at an open mic set up in the plaza. Predictably, the government responded by arresting and detaining scores of artists, activists, and independent journalists, which amounted, in my estimation, to an even more public performance of the government's own typically repressive tactics, as news of the event echoed in the international media on the final day of 2014. Thus, while we can celebrate the fact that the US and Cuban governments have finally agreed to begin respectful diplomatic engagement, as we've seen the last 2 days in Havana, the Cuban government's continued failure to respectfully engage with the diverse and often dissenting voices of its own citizens makes us wonder, along with Bruguera, whether, quote, it's the Cuban people who will benefit from this new historic moment, as she put it in her previously circulated open letter to Raul Castro. Between 1996 and 2006, President Fidel Castro pursued an economic policy retrenchment that gradually phased out the pro-market reforms of the early 1990s, indicating that he was more aware of the political risks that popular entrepreneurship would pose to his centralized political control than of the economic benefits that it could provide. Therefore, he was unwilling to transfer more than a token of the state store, la tienda estatal, to private entrepreneurs. His brother, Raul Castro, whose presidency began in 2006, has significantly eased this resistance. While the underlying goal of economic reform is still officially to, quote, preserve and perfect socialism, unquote, he has started to deliberately and deliberatively shrink the state store, la tienda estatal, that I spoke about at the beginning, and transfer the production of many goods and services to the more than 500,000 private entrepreneurs and cooperative ventures that have been established in Cuba. However, much more remains to be done, and our argument in the book is to look at what has been done and then to examine what hasn't been done, why, and what we think needs to be done, even to meet the Cuban government's own expressed goals of economic growth and absorption of high unemployment as people are laid off from the state sector. So much more needs to be done in reforming policies toward microenterprise so that it can contribute fully to productive employment, innovation, and economic growth. For example, 70% of the newly self-employed were actually previously unemployed. But were they really unemployed? Actually, we suspect that they likely simply converted their previously existing underground enterprises into legal ones. This then would do very little to absorb the 1.8 million estimated workers who the state calls disponibles. I think maybe insultingly calls disponibles. Moreover, only 7% of the self-employed are university graduates, and most of them work in very low-tech activities because almost all professional self-employment is prohibited. This barrier to professional self-employment, we argue, acts as a blockade on the effective use of Cuba's well-educated labor force, obstructing innovation and productivity. A further goal of these reforms, these tentative reforms, so far has been to facilitate the emergence of a cooperative sector, non-agricultural cooperative sector, and the small enterprise sector so that they can contribute and generate sustained improvements in standards of living in Cuba. However, we believe, and we argue in the book, that this can only be achieved with additional reforms that double down, go deeper, and much broader, effectively ending the embargo against Cuban entrepreneurs. What are some of these suggestions that we make in the book? Among the necessary changes would be opening up private enterprise to professionals, implementing affordable wholesale markets, providing access to foreign exchange and imports. Imports and exports, of course, are a fiercely guarded state monopoly. Establishing effective credit facilities, permitting the establishment of retailing enterprises, and relaxing the tax burden on small enterprise. Interestingly, even in the new foreign investment law that was published this year and went into effect over the summer, there is a discriminatory tax that remains against native entrepreneurs and business people, but a benefit that is given in favor of foreign investors. Progress in all of the areas that I just mentioned would be greatly facilitated by access to U.S. investors and markets, both as a source of desperately needed wholesale inputs and as a place to sell their products, something now possible following the implementation of Obama's historic policy changes, and this will be developing over the coming year. The U.S. Department of State is currently trying to put together a list or categories or some kind of legal framework that will allow people in Cuba to sell their goods from the private and cooperative sectors to the United States. Of course, there's two big questions with that. Will the U.S. Congress allow that? But a bigger question, will the Cuban government itself allow that? Because they would either have to give up their monopoly on exports or agree to be an intermediary between the United States and Cuban private entrepreneurs. Therefore, it remains to be seen whether Raul has the political will to intensify the internal reform process. The outright prohibition of activities the government prefers to keep under state monopoly allows it to exercise a symbolic and very effective control over Cuban citizens and impose an apparent order over Cuban society. However, this comes at a very great cost. It is the cost of pushing all targeted economic activity, along with potential tax revenue, into the black market, where much of it has lived for many, many years prior to 2010, and much of it still lives. On the other hand, on the bright side, we could say, the inclusion and regulation of the many private activities dreamed up and market tested by Cuba's always inventive entrepreneurial sector would create more jobs, a higher quality and standard of living, a variety of goods. Those goods would be at lower prices. It would also increase tax revenue, but these benefits have a political cost. And that cost is allowing greater citizen autonomy, wealth and property in private hands, and open competition against state monopolies. Later on, if we have time, I'll read a quote from one of the interviews that we did in Cuba. Alicia, she had an observation. She runs a paladar in Havana, and I visited her first in 2000, then in 2001, and I visited her a number of times up until 2011. And she said, you know, what's ironic, and it doesn't make much sense, is that we were taught as Cubans all of our lives that everything, according to Karl Marx, has a material base. It all comes down, show me the money, right? But she said that philosophy works maybe everywhere in the world except for in Cuba, because in Cuba everything has a political base. Everything is reduced to what does it mean politically, for politics. The viability of Cuba's reform process also depends on the recently announced changes in U.S. policy toward Cuba and on Cuba's changing policy toward its émigrés. These émigrés, many of whom are in the room, or some of whom are in the room, many of whom are in Miami, right? They already play a major role in the Cuban economy as suppliers of startup capital via the billions of dollars that they send each year in remittances to the island. This kind of investment could be expanded if the Cuban government were to deepen its recent migration reforms by granting greater economic rights to its extensive diaspora abroad. Obama's relaxation of U.S. policy will inevitably shift the political calculus that underlies economic reforms on the island. As external obstacles to Cuba's economic revitalization are removed, the onus will fall with increased pressure on the Cuban government to broaden and deepen its initial tentative economic reforms. Why? Because it alone will now be to blame for poor performance. For example, organizations like the Catholic Church affiliated Cuba Emprende have already begun to offer entrepreneurship workshops to small business owners in three different Cuban cities with the financial backing of, guess who? Cuban Americans. Now that they needn't worry about the threat of U.S. sanctions, will this and other similar projects be provided the legal and institutional space to flourish by the Cuban government? In other words, it takes two or maybe three to tango. The governments on either side, but the entrepreneurs in the middle. Now what I want to do, what time is it, just to check in?
7.
Almost 7? Okay. So what I want to do now is say a few words about the internet in Cuba. Because in the book, although we talk about entrepreneurs, we also have in the section and the chapter on the underground economy. Chapter 7 of the book is all about Cuba's underground economy, why it exists, how it functions, and the extremely rich variety of ways that it exists. And part of that, part of the examples of the underground economy we talk about in relation to the internet, because there's some very innovative Cubans who have basically invented an alternative internet in Cuba in the black market. And we'll talk about, I'll mention that here before concluding. Despite a continued state monopoly on the mass media and one of the Western Hemisphere's lowest internet penetration rates, in recent years, Cuba has seen a number of significant developments in what is often referred to as ICT, Information and Communication Technology. There are more seats over here on this side and over here on this side. I'm very, very proud to almost fill this room, so please come in if you're standing there and you're looking for a seat. Don't worry about interrupting. Come on in. And so what are these developments that have happened over the last, let's say, 5 to 7 years in Cuban ICT? First of all, there's been a spread of the worldwide blogging and citizen journalism phenomena to Cuba. Second, there's a connection of a fiber optic cable to the island from Venezuela. This happened in 2013. This was followed by the opening of, at least initially, 118 cyber cafes in June of 2013. And then over the last year, in 2014, Cubans who have cell phone service through Nauta can actually get email on their cell phones. A third development is the appearance of a small number of independent, island-based news outlets, including the news and opinion websites Havana Times, On Cuba, and 14 y Medio. 14 y Medio, of course, was launched in May by pioneering blogger, and I'm proud to say my personal friend, Yoani Sanchez, in May of 2014. Fourth, there have been the creation of a number of unauthorized mesh networks that use private Wi-Fi networks to communicate and share information. This is kind of the Cuban version of whack-a-mole. the mole pops up and the Cuban government whacks it. But these independent Wi-Fi networks are often put together by young people who often have no other purpose than to play games with one another over this Wi-Fi network. But of course, there's a political aspect to that about control, about power, and they're often raided and shut down, but they keep popping up. Finally, and the development that's most probably interesting, most relevant to most Cubans, and that I'm going to elaborate a little bit on, is called el paquete, the packet. This is an underground digital data distribution system that exists on the island. Each of these developments could be accelerated by the new U.S. policy that allows American telecom providers to do business in Cuba, but siempre hay un pero, no? Only if the Cuban government is willing to allow diversification and freer competition in its centralized monopolistic ICT system. For example, the so-called paquete phenomenon. It currently acts as an alternate offline internet on the island, making huge amounts of electronic data, CDs, DVDs, video games, books, apps, computer programs, news, and what have you. This information is readily available for purchase in Cuba's digital black market. While much of the data continues to circulate via thumb drives, there is also a market for entire external hard drives of data bought and sold not in megabytes, not in gigabytes, but actually in terabytes. And all of this happens outside of the rigid control of the state media production and distribution system. This, in my opinion, and we've seen in the Cuban press over the last 6 months a kind of feverish worry about this, this amounts to an indirect but very serious and effective challenge to the so-called política cultural de la revolución, the revolution's cultural policy that many of you probably unfortunately know it by heart, dentro de la revolución todo, contra la revolución nada. Within the revolution everything, against the revolution nothing. That kind of has a chilling effect on cultural production. This is being defied by the paquete. The digital black market arises from the fact that many products, especially the latest electronic gadgets, are either priced far out of reach for most Cubans en las tiendas estatales, or not sold at all. Sometimes they're even banned outright. More recently, a small but rapidly growing number of Cubans who have joined the smartphone revolution have benefited from the proliferation of apps, especially configured for Cuba's peculiar offline environment. Undoubtedly, such a peculiar digital media environment would be fundamentally transformed if American data service and hardware providers were given access to the Cuban market. At the very least, prices are bound to fall, speed increase, and access expand, with the quality and quantity of digital ICT equipment improving. A key recent development was in June of 2014. There was a trip of top Google executives to the island, including company co-founder Eric Schmidt. The expressed and published purpose of the visit by Google to Cuba was to, quote, promote a free and open internet, unquote. To that end, they both met with leading cyber activist Yoani Sanchez and her team at 14 y Medio. They also met with government officials while also interacting with students at Cuba's University of Computer Science. Upon returning to the United States, Schmidt declared that Cuba was trapped in the internet of the 1990s and heavily censored, with American-engineered hardware and software losing out to Chinese ICT infrastructure. Schmidt also reasoned that the U.S. embargo, quote, makes absolutely no sense, unquote, if Washington's aim is to open the island to the freer flow of information. Again, to quote Schmidt, If you wish the country to modernize, the best way to do this is to empower the citizens with smartphones and encourage freedom of expression and put information tools in the hands of Cubans directly," unquote. The greatly expanded telecom opportunities for U.S. companies and the decision to review the designation of Cuba as a state sponsor of terrorism, both included in December's announcement to normalize relations, indicate that the Obama administration was convinced by Schmitt's logic. And now to conclude. The slow pace and so far only marginally successful results of Cuba's economic reforms to date has put the Cuban government under rising internal pressure to expand internet services and pressure from abroad to meet the needs of the new foreign investors it hopes to attract. This eventuality, now with the help of U.S. investment and technology, could positively impact the population's access to the internet, to the web. At the same time, the government is clearly looking to the Chinese example as it contemplates ramping up its own internet capabilities. What does the Cuban government hope to do? In my estimation, it's hoping to remake the web in its authoritarian image and forestall any of its democratizing impacts. Still, in the months following the Google visit, the company announced that it was unblocking island access to its free cloud-based Chrome search engine, as well as popular Google apps such as Google Play and Google Analytics. Of course, this decision could not have been made without the tacit approval of the Obama administration. Events in 2015 will reveal how much further the Cuban government is willing to allow Google and other internet companies and telecom companies to go. While these digital developments are significant, it remains difficult to determine to what extent these developments, those 5 that I mentioned before, Paquete, the bloggers, etc., to what extent do they affect or will they affect ordinary Cubans? I ask this question because the government itself of Cuba estimates an inflated internet access rate of an extremely low 26%. Even this figure, of course, conflates access to the internet with the island's own limited intranet. It also counts sporadic access to email in the same category as full access to the World Wide Web. Moreover, the 118 cyber cafes that were opened in 2013 provide access at $5 an hour. And those of you who know will know that $5 is 1/4 of the monthly salary or 1 week's average salary for a Cuban. And this will give you an idea of the limited impact and the elite orientation of internet access in Cuba. Thus, expanded access to ICT in Cuba takes place in a context of connectivity that can be described as slow, expensive, and censored, with certain sites, such as 14 y Medio, blocked outright. Devices such as computers, tablets, smartphones are scarce and expensive. The purchase and importation of key equipment such as routers and other Wi-Fi technology are highly controlled. Indeed, it is still not legally possible for the vast majority of Cuban citizens to even obtain household internet access. And there is virtually no legal access on the island to wireless networks and fully functional mobile technology, smartphones with data plans, outside of international hotels, certain government institutions, and select educational facilities. The government has recognized these limitations. It has even made promises to remedy them. However, there is no clear timeline or way to hold the Cuban government accountable or to hold the telecom monopoly, ETEXA, accountable to Cuban citizens, to Cuban consumers, and to Cuba's emerging class of entrepreneurs. Cuban citizens of all stripes regardless of their political, ideological, economic orientations, are working to overcome the substantial obstacles to entrepreneurship on the one hand and free expression and internet access on the other. This effort, however, takes place in an asphyxiating context, a climate of political polarization, where Cubans, in my opinion, have been doubly blockaded by the U.S. embargo on one side and by an ongoing internal embargo on the other. This is why the recent growth of domestic entrepreneurship and innovative engagement by internet companies like Google are so significant. This new approach seeks to engage and empower the Cuban people directly while accepting the risk of collateral benefit for the Cuban government. Instead of aiming to undermine the government with an embargo while accepting collateral damage that embargo inevitably has on the people. Now that this approach has been reinforced by the Obama administration's momentous decision to diplomatically engage the Cuban government as a way to further empower the Cuban people, making their lives, in the words of the president, un poco más fácil. He mispronounced that in that speech, but he did use the Spanish. Fácil, fácil. The ball is now clearly in Cuba's and Castro's court. The question then that we ask in the book and that I leave you with today to get the question started is, will he transform his initial economic reforms and marginal expansion of the internet into change that Cubans can believe and invest in? Thank you very much. So could someone give me the time? 12 after. Okay, so if someone could bring me a glass of water, we can do some Q&A. Anyone like to share a comment or a question? You're welcome to have either one. Just make it brief, and please identify yourself before you speak.
Hi, I'm Fernando Dinero. I'm owner of Inca Investments, a firm that makes investments throughout Latin America. You brought up that a lot of the capital that's going into the entrepreneurial class of Cuba is actually Miami-based. Now, it seems to me from that's actually heard the embargo, that's still an illegal activity that's just being done underground. Now, as far as opening up by these new regulations of funding for the cuentapropistas, it's the only thing I saw in the regulations was that it said that microfinancing can be approved. So it seems like one, it would be very small amounts, and two, it's based on an approval basis. So it doesn't seem like a very big opening from the U.S. side actually to be able to capitalize these micro enterprises in Cuba. So I'd like to just hear your comments on if you think I'm right in my interpretation, and two, what you think will happen so that the entrepreneurial class of Cuba can have access to capital.
Well, I think that if you're in a desert and there's a drop of rain, there's a big change, right? And so I think that some of the reaction has maybe been overestimating the depth of the change because there's been kind of a freeze for so long, right? And so I think that part of it maybe is overestimating what is potentially happening, possible legally. The second, I guess, thing I would say is that it's still unsure for many reasons, and it will work itself out over the next year or two. The last 2 years of President Obama's administration, to what extent what is laid out legally will actually have any impact, significant or marginal, for Cuban entrepreneurs. The State Department, as I mentioned briefly in my comments, is currently figuring out what signal to send both to Cuban entrepreneurs but also to the Cuban government. You have the U.S. Congress, of course, is going to play a big role in how far these things can be developed. But then you have the Cuban government, right? The Cuban government has this monopoly control. So I can't read a crystal ball and say what these things will be. But I think I think what Obama did, whether you agree with him or not, is he said, I'm going to go bold and I'm going to do everything in my power, limited as it is, because he's only the president. He's not, although some claim that he is, he's not the king of the United States, right? I'm going to do everything in my power to both challenge the Congress and to challenge the Cuban government to respond. And he justified that as a way to help and empower the Cuban people, right? Some people argue that it's going to empower the Cuban government much more than the people. And so my reading is that that is a risk. But my other reading is that the Cuban people, from what I could gather, are mostly very happy about the change. They don't know yet, they haven't felt any benefit from the change yet, and maybe it will be a dead letter. But I think that my argument is that if it is a dead letter, let it be the Cuban government that has to say it's a dead letter so that the Cuban people will blame the Cuban government and they can no longer be tricked into blaming the United States. So, yes, sir? Give us your name first.
Carlos Armengol. In your introduction, it was stated that you are not allowed back in Cuba. Is that correct?
Well, they never told me that. They never gave me any official notice, but they did tell me pretty clearly, and if you go to El Yuma blog, you'll see a very long post there describing my ordeal. They gave me a very unpleasant send-off in the airport, basically saying, hey, you're doing all this research in Cuba and you're on a tourist visa. What the hell? And I said, well, I asked the people if they were willing to participate in this research, and they said yes. They said, hey, but you have to ask us. You should be on the beach sipping mojitos, not visiting paladares and interviewing them about their business strategies. However, I have hope springs eternal, and if the U.S. and Cuban governments can sit down and talk, maybe they'll let the evil Ted Henken back into Cuba to interview more bloggers and entrepreneurs. I don't know, but I'm certainly not going to give up, and I'm going to keep trying. I have lots of colleagues in Cuba, lots of friends, both in the dissident community, in the blogger community, and the academic community. And I actually have had better relationships with those host of people since I got kicked out than before. So it was probably the best thing that the Cuban government could have ever done for me, right? I thank Raul also for the shift, even though some people call his opening to entrepreneurship a facade or buying time. It certainly makes the research that we've been doing over the past 10 or 15 years in Cuba very pertinent. And then, after I wrote Obama that letter saying, hey, do something else, he of course, he listened to me also, right? So, but anyway, that I don't have any control over that, and I just, try to be open and honest and straightforward, and hope for the best, in terms of that.
Yes. Nicolas Sanchez.
Okay, first, thank you very much for a very informative presentation, but I have two very quick questions. Okay, one has to do with the fact that American companies in the United States have to pay a fee, a very big fee, if they engage in corruption abroad. And that can be very, very substantial. Now, as you well know, there is a great deal of corruption in Cuba. So how could the companies be able to operate in Cuba if they cannot, in fact, engage in corruption? That's my first question.
Okay, let me answer your first question, and then if there's time, I'll let you ask your second question, okay? Because the other people wanted to ask. Cuba on the Transparency International scale is about in the middle, and Transparency International, in terms of the level of corruption relative to anywhere else in the world, and Transparency International gets its ranking basically by interviewing foreign business people who do business in X country, in this case in Cuba. And I wouldn't doubt that there's a lot of corruption, especially at the high level for access. There's been a number of court cases in Cuba where they threw the book at a Canadian and I think a British companies and investors. That certainly doesn't bode well for other companies wanting to go into business in Cuba because of the opportunity cost of getting thrown into jail or having to pay a fine, and in your argument, paying a fine in the United States. I think that that's a concern that those businesses that, I mean, it's one thing to make it legal to open up to do some business in Cuba. It's another thing for those companies to make the decision whether it's worth it for them. A lot of the companies, I imagine, American companies, are talking to their Spanish or Canadian or other partners and saying, so what advice can you give us? Some of them are going to say, don't go there, right? Don't go there, don't go to Cuba. However, we did see, I think it was today, that MasterCard certainly wants to get credit card fees and credit card business in Cuba. They just made it possible for Americans to use MasterCard in Cuba. So I think we will see over the next year, and we may even see cases where American companies are either fined by the U.S. or prosecuted or accused by the Cuban government of corruption. Yes, sir, Ambassador. Very nice to see you here again.
My question is, I understand that you actually mentioned that the Raul Castro's strategy would be to go for some sort of Chinese model, which means combination of authoritarian regime and some sort of state capitalism. And now you have two schools of thoughts, maybe cuentapropistas, or these small entrepreneurs versus dissidents. Dissidents, or those who fight for human rights in Cuba, have some doubts whether this is a right strategy. Do you do you have any advice how to improve the communication between, let's say, those who are trying to run their private businesses with the help of their American family members and might be more vulnerable to, let's say, political manipulations because they are interested in running their businesses in certain conditions,
right,
and those who are just human rights defenders?
Well, I think that there is a danger that Cuba will go the way of China. Some people will see that as a positive, you know, in terms of economic growth, but also in terms of the economic shift, a capitalist economy built inside of the control of the state capitalism. That is possible. I think that there's a Cuban named Eliezer Avila, who many of you know from his YouTube fame, but he has survived YouTube fame and he continues to be an activist in Cuba. And he told me that one of the biggest struggles that he has as he's met and networked with other human rights and freedom of expression advocates, is to try to build bridges into the Cuban population and not be isolated. It's very hard for them to do that because there's a state control, monopoly control over the mass media, and so before they ever knock on anyone's door, they've already been labeled mercenary before they ever go. And so that is a very big challenge for them. I think that what Roberta Jacobson did today as an outsider, as an American, I mean, Cuba's problem shouldn't be solved or expected to be solved by the United States in the past, in the present, or in the future. But I think her willingness, her refusal to agree with the urging of the Cuban government not to meet with dissidents. She had a breakfast this morning, a working breakfast, where she heard from people who agree with U.S. policy. She heard from people who kind of are neutral or who have criticized it. And she even had people at this breakfast who called it an abandonment or a betrayal of the dissident movement. And I think that kind of example of talking to people you disagree with is a good one. The dissident community, I think, in some ways has a big challenge now, because now it's not just a challenge for the Cuban government to respond to, but the dissident community to respond in terms of building cross-hatching connections and bridges, not just between one another, which they've started to do. They've come out with these 4 fundamental demands from the civil society that I think are should be universally acceptable, but also they have to now try to make inroads with the Cuban people. Of course, under the constant repression and the detentions that the government is rolling out. One of my hopes is that the United States will now have more allies as it criticizes Cuban human rights abuses, because now everyone is no longer going to be talking about the U.S. embargo, and hopefully they'll be talking about the internal embargo. Whenever anyone calls me in the media, I say, okay, it's from the external embargo to the internal embargo, and you guys got to start talking about the internal embargo if you want progress. Another question? Can I get a time check?
25.
Okay, we got 5 minutes. All right, yes, sir.
Kirk Menendez. In the past, Congress has had a push, even in the Republican Party, from the legislators from the agricultural states, and I can only imagine now the push might be stronger. You mentioned the issue of the embargo the U.S. getting blamed for the embargo may go away, the focus may shift, but the embargo is still there. What do you foresee happening in Congress as the next presidential election comes close? I'm sure it'll be an issue,
Right.
but there's so many states and so many folks that you would anticipate would be in support of maintaining a hold on the Castro government, but have been pushing and may want to push more for a complete lifting of the embargo.
Well, I think that what we're going to see in some ways is, to the extent that we can see over the next 6, 12 months, 16, 18 months, any effect that these changes are going to have on the ground in Cuba, then that's going to affect the congressional debate. Within the Republican Party, there's not unanimity on support for the embargo, but Republicans are willing to listen to Menendez on the Democratic side and Rubio on the Republican side, who say this is a bad policy and it should be we should make sure that it doesn't have any effect. But that argument, I think, will lose credibility if we see some kind of success, progress, improvement, either in the area of human rights, in the area of economic growth, or in the area of access to technology, communication, information, right? If the Obama administration and anyone who supports the change, whether they're Republican or Democrat, can show that, that will make the congressional debate different and will give more space and more ammunition to people who are running for president in 2016, right? To say, I'm going to double down or I'm going to continue this policy versus I'm going to fight this policy or do away with this policy. I'm sure that in Florida you're going to hear a lot about this because 2 of the potential presidential nominees on the Republican side are from here, and they have very strong views about this. So I think what we should do is we should make that the last question because I want to make 1 or 2 announcements and then we'll close out. The books are for sale. I realize that it's an academic book. It's a heavy book and it has a heavy price. But I'm not sure how many books they have for sale. If they run out, come see me and I can help you find a copy of the book that maybe won't be as heavy on your pocketbook. But please, they had I think 10, but do you know how many you guys have? 5 left? Okay, there's 5 left. I brought some of my own, but I'm only going to sell them to you once they sell out because they've been so kind in hosting us. I'd like to get a round of applause for Books and Books. And also there's another event that's taking place in half an hour from now. My book, unfortunately, they wouldn't let me put any photos in it because they say it would cost too much. But this book is a fabulous photo book, Unseen Cuba. It had a great spread in the Miami Herald this week. And the author has many stories and pictures to share. So thank you very much for coming. I'm going to be on the other side signing books. So come see me and stay in touch.
Thank you, Ted. I will also mention that Entrepreneurial Cuba, Ted's book, will be available at our store, Books and Books of Havana, but that's not for about 6 months or so. Anyway, he's signing on the other side. Stick around at 8 o'clock. We've got this event coming up. There's live music in the courtyard. We got food, we got beer, we got wine. Thank you all so much for coming. Bye.